Without wasting your time, we are going to share top 5 best magnesium Firestarter. The product links are in the description and in first comment. The number 5 on the list is Stormproof Match. Stormproof Match, short for ferrocerium ferro, is a relatively soft metal alloy made most often with a combination of iron and magnesium. These types of fire starters need to be used with some kind of striker tool, usually a piece of edged metal that is literally scraped quickly against a ferro rod in order to create a shower of sparks, which limits their versatility somewhat and requires the use of 2 hands. However, the benefit is that they make some of the hottest, brightest sparks and are quite easy to start fires with flint and steel. When people think of fire starters, this is usually what they're imagining. Typically made up of 2 parts, a piece of steel and flint, a form of quartz. These types of starters are usually operated by physically striking the flint and steel together, which actually shaves off bits of the steel and ignites them. They can be durable, but the sparks aren't as powerful and therefore not as easy to start a fire with when compared to some of the other options. If using this option, make sure you have some kind of tinder dot beneath in order to properly start that fire. Lighter, undoubtedly the simplest fire starting tool. Lighters are modern inventions, at least compared to the rest of these common types, that are easy to use with one hand and are remarkably reliable so long as they have fuel in them, usually in the form of ignition fluid like butane or even electricity. Obviously that means they're limited by how much fuel they have, and, especially with cheaper disposable versions, they don't always work in inclement weather, especially wind and rain. Magnesium block, operating on roughly the same principle as ferro rods and flint and steel fire starters, meaning they're meant to be used with an additional striker or striking surface. This variety differs in that the magnesium typically comes in a rectangular format rather than a cylinder. The benefit to this is that it allows for a lot more surface area, meaning you can create a huge amount of sparks. The downside to these is that they can be a bit more unwieldy than their counterparts, typically made out of wood and tipped with a material or materials that can be easily stricken and ignited, usually on a sandpaper-like surface, but strike anywhere varieties can be used on a multitude of surfaces. These are amongst the most common and well-known fire starters around. The number 4 on the list is Titan Firestriker. Titan Firestriker. The Titan works pretty well as a fire starter. Starting with small, carefully chosen dry tinder, it's easily capable of starting a quick fire thanks to the hot spark and large rod. The action does take a bit of pressure, but I was able to routinely produce a spark and thus a fire with the right ingredients. Practice makes perfect. Initially, striking is a little difficult, but once the striker removes the surface of the rod and it starts to flatten out, from where it gets easier and easier, producing better and better sparks as it progresses. So I definitely recommend breaking it, and it does a great job of starting camp stoves and burners also. The striker feels in the hand, but the cutout for the hex wrench can create some soreness with enough use as the thumb digs into the indentation. Thankfully, it's only an issue when taking many strikes in a row and won't come up too often. The grip is good enough to keep it from sliding out of the hand, but in wet conditions, it can get a little slippery, especially with cold hands. The entire kit is rather convenient, with it easily fitting into a pocket, tossed into a pack, or its best use, put aside into a survival kit. It doesn't need to be kept dry either, so it can be stashed anywhere that is quick and convenient to access at around bucks. It's a handy piece of kit to have that works rather well. I would prefer the striker to be a little larger or even to have some sort of built-in grip, but it does what it is supposed to. Sacrificing some comfort in the grip to fit in the additional functions is a smart move. When it comes to a survival tool, it cuts weight, applies additional functionality that can really come in handy in many situations, so to me the compromise is totally worth it. The number 3 on the list is Firelight. Firelight. Overall, I thought that the fuel-free rechargeable lighter was an effective, well-designed piece of gear. Some people would say that the battery-powered aspect of it is a negative because it could fail. I wouldn't disagree with that, but I always recommend carrying a second fire source and don't see it as a problem. For me, the ease of starting a fire easily in windy conditions outweighs the unlikely odds of the battery somehow failing. If it did, I'd be prepared anyway. The last thing I'll say is that it's great for anyone who is introducing kids to the fire building part of camping because it's safer than matches. Yes, it can still burn your finger, but the push and point way of starting a fire is very safe. You can still teach kids about tinder and kindling which is the most important thing to know anyway, and they'll feel like they helped out in setting up camp. The Firelight fuel-free rechargeable lighter worked as well or better than a standard lighter in almost every situation I used it in. The little crackling plasma arc isn't a gimmick, it actually works incredibly well. As I said earlier, I always carry 2 fire sources and I'll be using this one as my go-to moving forward. The number 2 on the list is Blast Match. Blast Match, when it works really well. It generates sparks estimated at degrees in a brilliant shower. This is hotter than an ordinary lighter or match by far. Second, it needs a solid surface to push against a bar. You cannot use a finger or hand unless you want your fingers exposed to degrees. I have been unable to find a way to use it, therefore to start a stove I suppose it depends on the stove, but the surface needed has to be considerable force is needed to thrust the unit downward to generate the sparks. For campfires it beats other strikers to a major degree mostly. Third, the sparking bar is retained in the unit with what seems to be rubber cement. It can come loose and in fact did once on me. It also did so on the program that I originally saw it on. It appears not to be a mistake of design, but deliberately designed to allow replacement of the bar. When it is exhausted, the bar is thick and unlikely to wear out anytime soon. I suspect the unit will be trash by the time the bar is worn out. When the bar did come loose, I was able to remount it without replacing the cement. Nuded up people on the veldt seem to have more issues for those of us who wear clothes that might not be critical. The number 1 on the list is Firestarter. Firestarter, the spring-loaded mechanism might be essential for the striker to work. The bar is retained in the holder, and by pressing it in a particular way the bar springs out ready for use. As noted, it needs a solid surface to push against. The ground will work, a fragile pile of twigs or hand-held paper. Tinder will not. I suppose you could put the paper against the ground and use the earth as a backer for some fragile tinders. If the spring breaks or otherwise fails, you maybe could use gravity to drop the bar out of the holder and manipulate the striker to work. The blast match costs many times what a sparking bar and separate striker will. You could own maybe 5 or 6 of the simpler item for what the blast match costs, even paying full retail. The Chinese sell oversized magnesium bars up to on. Smaller models sell for as little. You make your own striker from a used hacksaw blade. Hint: snap off a piece of hacksaw blade, grind off the paint and the kerf of the teeth, put a bevel on the back of the blade. With judicious grinding I use like degrees sharp might work. Put a plastic cable tie through the hole to avoid loss. Final thoughts: you cannot readily scrape off significant amounts of shavings from the bar to use as tinder. This may not be a problem as the shower of sparks is incredibly dense, far denser than an ordinary sparking bar with a piece of hacksaw blade scraper. You can sort of do this by pressing the unit down slowly and with less pressure on the striker. In no way, however, can you get many shavings. I could not, at least.